Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was the owner of a cafe diner. Even the gods and goddesses of Olympus needed a day off. Sometimes they needed time away from the constant bickering and never-ending controversies of their family. On one such day, Wisdom and Moon found themselves discovering a hidden gem within the city that never sleeps, and meeting a familiar blonde knucklehead with a penchant for the color orange. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 3, Part 3. Dining with Divinity. Letting out a yawn, Naruto rubbed his face as he tried to wipe the sleep out of his eyes. Waking up at 5 am every morning had been a struggle initially. For as long as the blonde shinobi could remember, he'd never been a morning person. From his time in the academy to his days as a member of Team 7, and even during his tenure as the 7th Hokage of Hidden Leaf Village, waking up at such an obscene time was a struggle. These days, being the owner of a cafe diner required him to open up hours before the rest of the world opened their eyes, and get everything ready for the day that lay ahead. He didn't have the luxury of Kakashi-sensei, or later on, Hinata, to wake him up anymore. He could have made a shadow clone and have the clone do it, but he knew if he did that, and remained in bed, he would do it every morning. He didn't want to fall into the trap of beginning a bad habit. It was the same reason he didn't use the hydration to get to work. Besides, the walk from his home to the fox's den helped wake him up. It was Sunday, which meant he was only open until 2. After that, he planned on going home and sleeping the day away until it was time to restart his week all over again. Walking the streets at such an early time, it would always surprise him to see people much like himself, out and about already starting their day. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the brisk chill of the air nipped at his skin, reddening his cheeks and the tip of his nose. He nodded his head at a passerby, who was heading towards a nearby OPS truck as packages of all sizes were being loaded on and off with great care. OPS? That must be new. Morning. Good morning. Rounding the corner, he sniffled when the fox's den came into sight with its bright orange frame standing out amongst the dull colors of the other building. Didn't people understand if they wanted to attract the attention of the people passing by, then what better way was there than using the brightest shade of the best color in the world? If nothing else, it would cause people to stop and look. Digging into his pockets and pulling out a key, he quickly entered the fox's den and locked the door behind him. Switching the lights on, he could still detect the lingering scent of chocolate and coffee from the day before. Shaking the cold away, he eyed up the coffee machine to warm him up as he removed his coat and hung it up in his office, which was nothing more than a little hole in the wall room where he could keep all the legal stuff and keep the computer. Crossing his fingers, he called out his trademark jutsu, Shadow Clone's Jutsu. 24 Narutos appeared in front of him, falling into 3 lines of 8 and offered the original a quick-fingered salute. Alright, you all know the drill. The list of what we need to make this morning will be on the countertop. The special of the day won't be anything too fancy, but I thought we'd go with a blueberry skyr cheesecake. He watched them nod their heads. The skyr yogurt is on the top shelf. If we need any more, hydration over to Reykjavik and head to that store I frequented when last there. The one nearest to the theater house. They nodded again, forcing him to clap his hands together. Alright then. You know what to do. Let's go. Hi. One by one, the clones made their way into the kitchen, the door flapping in an endless loop as each clone passed through. Letting out another yawn, he turned around and started the process of switching the machines on, from the coffee grinder to the espresso machine, to the automatic drip coffee makers. While his clones handled the baking in the kitchen, he'd handle setting the place up in the front before joining them. While he was on his own in the front, he made himself a drink while he could. The blonde ninja was fond of a Spanish latte, though instead of sugar, he added a splash of honey. Honey was packed full of natural sweetness and energy, and in his opinion, a better option than sugar. His hands moved together with perfect fluidity thanks to constant repetition. Honey, along with a shot of espresso added to the mix, made him hum in delight as he brought the drink up to his mouth. Now that was the good stuff. When he was younger, he never imagined anything coming close to his love for ramen. However, these days he couldn't imagine a morning without some form of caffeine to start his day. He had a couple of hours before he opened his doors to the public. Once open, he estimated he'd have around 10 minutes before the first batch of customers started filing their way in, likely for a takeaway order. Wandering the earth for as long as he had, the blonde owner of the Fox's Den had become good at reading people. He knew when to talk to his customers, and when to leave them be and let them get on with their day. Disappearing once again into the back room, he returned moments later with a large cardboard box in his arms and placed it down on the counter. Unsealing the top, he got a glimpse of the inside. His new order of paper cups had arrived the day before, and like most things in his life, they were bright orange too. A majority of his customers during the morning rush took their orders away with them, and his paper cups were nothing more than the store-bought cups anyone could purchase. These new ones were ordered and designed for the Fox's Den, with a Chiba-styled fox sporting 9 tails in the center drinking a coffee. There could never be too much orange in one person's life. Not to mention, he came to accept it was the little things in life that kept him going. Who knew new paper cups would spout a smile on his face? He hoped Kurama didn't mind having his silhouette as the new logo for his business. His face if he saw these. He'd be so mad. He whispered, staring at the Chiba fox on the cup, and letting out a low laugh, he'd never forgive me for turning him into a cute cartoon. Knock knock knock. Blinking in surprise at the sound, Naruto turned around and faced the doorway, and found himself staring back at a pair of blue eyes on the other side of the glass. Stood with one hand knocking against the glass, was a man somewhere in his late 20s if he had to guess, and dressed up like a mailman, shorts and all. The man possessed dark curly hair poking out from beneath his hat, with elfish features, and looked like he was in desperate need of a good night's sleep with dark shadows forming beneath his eyes. It was even more evident when the man broke out into a yawn. The man then offered him a wave. "Hey. Any chance I can come in?" Moments earlier. "We got another delivery come in. It looks like another set of packages have come in for Janice. He's requesting it for delivery at 8 a.m. sharp." Hermes heard, and noticed the heads of George and Martha come to life and turning to look at him. A loud ping followed after, and Hermes couldn't stop the groan from leaving his mouth as he watched Janice's name popped up on the itinerary. As was his every day, the god of messengers, travelers, thieves, and a whole array of other domains found himself piled high with his usual responsibilities and duties. None of his Olympian brothers had ever worked the kind of hours he worked regularly. Apollo, in particular, as much as he loved his best friend and older brother, was going through his lazy season. The god of the sun worked little during the winter season, hence why the days were short and the nights long, much to the ire of his twin sister. The sun god spent his time slacking off when he should have been fulfilling his godly duties and wooing beautiful mortals and bringing them to his bed. "We just left New Rome an hour ago. What's is Janus ordering this time?" As much as Hermes wanted to do the same, his godly domains were some of the most time-consuming with the world today and left little room for him to enjoy the pleasures that came with modern society. Back in the day, it was his duty to watch over the travelers and merchants as they went on their long and arduous journeys across Greece and deliver the messages from the sky to the sea, and the underworld. As one of the few gods who had permission to cross into the domains of his father and his uncles, it made his position on Olympus all the more important. These days, his domains that humanity fell under became so varied thanks to society adapting and growing as a whole, that he became the busiest Olympian out of his whole family. One positive though was that out of all the gods, Hermes felt he was the one who had the best understanding of mortals, thanks to all the time he spent mingling with them. The only ones that came close were Athena and Artemis. With today's developments, his immortal family was keeping him busier than ever. Athena and Aphrodite even had the gall to have him deliver their demigods to their mortal parents moments after their birth. You'd think that was something that needed a face-to-face conversation, but apparently, he was wrong. On the rare occasion when he didn't have to work, he often found himself stealing a page out of Apollo's book, spending the night with a woman. There was honestly no better stress relief than a good old-fashioned rumble and tumble in the bedroom, which often led to the birth of his demigod children. Speaking of his demigod children, Hermes felt a flicker of his essence pulsate a few days back somewhere out in California. It was a feeling he'd felt many times before when his demigod children were born. It turned out, a young woman that he spent the night with during the spring of last year had given birth to his latest son. If it wasn't for his hectic schedule, and the laws Olympus followed, he would visit his children as often as he could. As it was, the best he could do was watch over them, and their mothers from afar and offer them aid when he could. Eyeing up the two snakes that wrapped themselves around his famous caduceus, the two let out a low hiss as they looked over the list of deliveries he kept on the monitor at all times. Looks like he ordered Season 3 and 4 of CSI, Crime Scene Investigation on DVD. What? He could have just snapped his fingers and made them appear if he wanted them so bad. Throwing his hands in the air, the son of Zeus glared at the monitor. I swear to Hades, that damn border god is doing this on purpose. Just order from Amazon. Not me. We got another order coming in. This time from Dionysus. Hermes rolled his eyes. No, no, no. I know what that drunk is trying to get a hold of. He leaned forward and deleted the incoming order with a click of his fingers. Grabbing his notepad, he wrote down a short message for the god of wine, before clicking his fingers and sending it off to the wine god's residence at Camp Half-Blood. Ever since Dionysus made the mistake of chasing after a nymph that Zeus declared off limits, he'd been forced to remain sober and not touch any source of wine for 100 years, as well as run Camp Half-Blood. His punishment made his younger brother miserable. If he thinks I'm falling for his tricks, then think again. He forgets I'm the god of thieves. His brother would be angry, but he could handle Dionysus. Falling back against his seat, Hermes rubbed his eyes and couldn't stop the yawn from escaping his mouth. Gods, he was tired. The rest of his family didn't know how good they had it. I need coffee, otherwise, I'm not going to make it. Stretching out his hand, a mug reading, World's Best Grandma, a recent present from Apollo appeared, coffee filled to the top inside. Giving it a quick sniff, he brought it up to his lips and instantly regretted it. Rolling down the window, Hermes spat the coffee out onto the street, followed soon after by the rest of the mug. As a god, he could make almost anything appear if he willed it so. All he had to do was picture it in his mind, and will it to be. However, with food and drinks and other edible delicacies, said god had to have some skill over the art. He wasn't bad by any means and was known to treat his mortal lovers to a home-cooked meal from time to time, which made the food he conjured pretty good. His Aunt Hestia and even his stepmother had given him their stamp of approval. Yet, for some reason unbeknownst to him, Hermes could never make a decent cup of coffee. His was the most ridiculous thing. No matter how hard he tried, the Olympian could not crack the code after years of practicing. It was such a mundane thing, yet he failed miserably at it. If Apollo, Ares, or any of his brothers found out, they wouldn't let him live it down. Feeling someone tapping his leg, Hermes glanced over at George and Martha, the latter of whom was trying to get his attention. What? We can afford to take a short break. Why not make a stop and get refreshments? Oh? And where do you suggest? He watched as the two snakes turned to look at each other, whisper something to one another, before turning back to look at him. How about that place up the street? Hermes blinked. Place up the street. He leaned forward and squinted his eyes. It took him a moment to realize what George and Martha were trying to point out. Up the road, not even a minute walk, he spotted a light on in one of the nearby windows. Despite Apollo not yet flying his chariot through the sky, street lights were enough to show off the orange frame that wrapped around the front of the store. The Fox's Den. He read, before tapping his chin. Why does that sound familiar? It's the cafe Aphrodite mentioned a fortnight ago at Apollo's poker night. George hissed, as realization lit up his face. Oh, that's right. How could he forget? It was all Aphrodite went on about all night. After a while, Hermes, along with everyone else, had tuned out the love goddess, but some of what she said had filtered in. All he remembered her saying was that some hunk immortal made one of the most delicious strawberry milkshakes and dessert she'd ever tasted, and that it was so good that Olympus's most beautiful goddess rewarded the mortal with a big smooch in the middle of his establishment. It was so good that she dared to say it might be as good as the delicacies Aunt Hestia and Aunt Hera were known to create. If he remembered right, even Athena and Artemis enjoyed it. If his two elder sisters enjoyed something created by a male mortal, then he must have been good. They were notoriously picky and hard to please. Grinning, Hermes didn't hear what George and Martha said next, before waving his hand and turning his caduceus to its phone form. The Olympian god was already on his feet, closing his truck door shut with newfound energy as he marched over to the fox's den. Well, let's go and see what the fuss is about. Present. Leaving the counter, the blonde owner of the fox's den walked closer to the door, gazing curiously at the man of the other side. Hey, I'm not open yet, and I won't be open for a couple of hours. He pointed to the clock behind on the wall behind the counter. Come back later, and I'll be happy to take your order. What hope he had that the guy would take his word and leave was proven false when the guy didn't move. Aw, come on. Can't you make an exception this once? Hermes put his hands together in a prayer motion. I've been up for hours. I need a little pick-me-up, that's all. Rolling his eyes and feeling a headache coming on, Naruto took another step closer to the door. It was too early for this. Look, I haven't got much ready. I just walked through the door a minute ago myself. Why don't you go to Starbucks or something? I'm sure one of those is open 24/7. In response, Hermes made a face and stuck his tongue. No way. I hate all that franchise crap. They stopped making good coffee years ago, and I hear you make a hell of a drink. I have it from a reliable source that you're one of the best in the city. Oh? Who's this reliable source? One of his regular customers maybe? He wondered if one of those food critics stopped by. He thought he saw one stop by a week ago, taking notes on a little notepad and looking very up themselves. Every order sent his way, Naruto put a little bit of extra care into, resulting in the guy leaving with the biggest smile on his face. It was a good feeling watching his customers leave with big smiles on their faces. Hoping to get an answer, the blonde received a wagging finger in return instead. Ah! That would be telling. I could never give up my reliable sources, but no, they had nothing but glowing reviews about this place you have. Frowning, Naruto was about to speak, before he got cut off. You're here, and the machines are on. He pointed to the coffee machine behind the blonde and pointed to the coffee that was in Naruto's hands. Come on. Help a fella out. Scratching the back of his head, Naruto looked to and from the mailman and his machines, before letting out a reluctant sigh. Taking a deep breath, he ignored the dark-haired man making a fist in the air, and unlocked the door. No funny business. Got it. Giving the man a stern look, he watched as the mailman threw his hands up in the air. Don't worry. I come in peace and all that good stuff. Cross my heart. He made a little motion with his hands over his chest. I'll be gone before you know it. Right. Rubbing his eyes and looking at the man suspiciously, Naruto gave a short nod and led Hermes to the counter. His gut was telling him this guy was trouble. Something about the guy screamed prankster. He would know, being one himself. Handing Hermes a menu, the blonde leaned against the counter as he unwrapped his paper cups from their box and picked one out for use. Take a look, and tell me what takes your fancy. I'll let you know if it's currently available or not. You got it. Naruto made a motion, and poked his head through the door leading to the kitchen, giving his clones a subtle sign not to come out. He didn't need a mailman catching his clones at work, nor did he want to explain why there were dozens of himself. Nice place you have here. Thanks. The blonde replied. How long have you been open? Not long, the blonde admitted, about 2 months. I opened up before the Christmas period started. Kept me busy and gave this place the boost it needed, but it got crazy busy and hectic some days. I sometimes wondered if I made a mistake. Hermes nodded. I bet. Christmas is always the worst when you're in our line of work. Delivering goods to the people of the world in whatever form that takes. Glancing across the menu, Hermes whistled, an appraising and dubious look on his face. Wow. Aphrodite wasn't kidding when she said this menu was varied. There's something of everything in here. The Olympian would admit he wasn't one to visit cafes often. They were more his sister's kind of thing or his aunt's. Like his brothers, he preferred bars or nightclubs since he picked up most of his hookup from them, though he enjoyed an occasional beer or two to go with the night. I need something to keep me awake for the rest of the day. Not knowing much apart from the standard caffeine-based beverages, Hermes eyed the drink in Naruto's hand. What do you have? Oh, this. Naruto took a small swig of his drink. It's a Spanish latte. Curiosity piquing, Hermes leaned on the tabletop. Is it any different from a regular latte? To answer his question, he received a waved hand in the middle of the air. It's more of an espresso-based drink with textured milk and condensed milk. It's sweeter than a latte, but not as much as a latte with flavored syrup. Though I don't use sugar in my drink, and instead, use honey. Hermes nodded his head and liked the sound of everything he just heard. I'll take one of those. He especially liked the espresso part. That would do the trick in keeping him awake. Sure. Do you want food to take with you? Hermes scratched the back of his head, looking indecisive. If you can't decide, I've got some lemon squares left over from the day before. They won't be fresh, but they'll still taste good. I can have them bagged up for you. Free of charge since I made them the other day. The god's eyes lit up, and a bright expression washed over his face. That would be great. Thanks. No problem. Take a seat, and I'll bring them over. Watching as the blonde owner turned around and prepared his drink, Hermes spun around and headed for the closest table. Maybe this place was alright after all, and everything Aperdoit was spouting on about wasn't just hot air. The mortal appeared decent enough. After all, who would give away lemon squares for free? No one he'd ever met, that's for sure. Not to mention, if he could win over his male-hating sister, then the guy must be doing something right. Though, watching as the mortal went to work, he understood why Aphrodite kept mentioning the handsome owner. If he'd won over the goddess of love, then Hermes could count down the days she inevitably invited him into her bed. Her two biggest weaknesses after all were chocolates and handsome mortals. This guy represented both, which meant he was as good as hers, and he didn't even know it. Though, it could be hard with Athena and Artemis around. Both seemed equally as interested in the mortal, though for different reasons. As far as Hermes was concerned, he was staying out of any trouble those three might create. He thought back to the love goddess. Then again, she does like a challenge. He thought, leaning on the table and resting his head against his arms, I wonder if I should start a betting pool? 100 drachmas maybe. He would have to look into this some more when he wasn't feeling as tired. Sighing and rubbing his face as he waited for his order, Hermes shut his eyes and let his body relax. It was only for a minute. His schedule was getting busier by the minute, and spent all last night going from state to state. He earned this much. Granted, gods didn't need as much sleep as mortals did, and could theoretically remain awake for greater lengths of times. Sometimes days, and possibly even weeks depending on the god. However, he was reaching his limit. He just needed a moment to relax. After a few minutes passed, Naruto finished the drink, capping the top with a plastic lid and adding a paper sleeve to the takeaway cup. Alright, that's your drink. Give me a moment, and I'll bag up those lemon squares I promised. You alive back there? Zzzzzzzzzzzzzzz. Stopping mid-step, Naruto glanced up from the drink, and his jaw dropped when he looked over at the table the mailman sat behind. You have to be kidding me. The Olympian had his face slumped against his arms, eyes covered by his forearm and mouth hanging wide open, causing loud snores and gargles to come out. A foot twitched against the leg of the chair, and his nose wrinkled. The blonde couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was this guy serious? He wasn't running a bed and breakfast. Marching over, Naruto initially gave Hermes a subtle shake to jolt him into consciousness. He whispered for him to wake up, but Hermes merely turned his head. When that failed, he shook him harder, adding some extra force into the shakes. When that also failed, he started throttling the guy, shaking him like a rag doll. Wake up, damn it. Despite Naruto practically throwing the guy around back and forth in his seat, the guy wouldn't wake up as he slumped back down on the table. The guy must have been the heaviest sleeper he'd ever seen. How heavy of a sleeper is he? This is ridiculous. He contemplated driving his fist into the back of his skull, reminiscent of Sakura waking him up during their Team 7 days. Though, he decided against it. It's not like this guy can't take the hit, he thought, standing back up and narrowing his eyes at the sleeping Olympian. I wasn't sure at first, but his energy matches those three women. He hides it well, and you'd think he was just an ordinary mailman, but he isn't. He acted normally around those women for the simple reason that they gave him no reason to be on guard with them. The blonde shinobi didn't say anything, staring at Hermes as the man's face twitched in his sleep. A smirk grew on his face and started cracking his neck and knuckles. If the guy wanted to fall asleep and leave himself open in such a manner, then that was his business. He was the one who knocked on his door before he was open. He'd been lenient, and let the guy in, but now the mailman had the guts to fall asleep as he was about to send him off with free lemon squares. This guy didn't know he was in the presence of Konoha's prankster king. Deep down in his heart, Naruto was still a prankster and always would be. Seeing a prime opportunity in front of him, he couldn't resist. It got him thinking. When was the last time he pulled a prank on someone? Surely it wasn't as long as he was picturing. Over a decade maybe? Either way, he needed to shake the rust from his mind. He wasn't sure how long he had, but he wasn't going to let this chance slip his grasp. Buddy, you don't understand what kind of a mistake you've made. 20 minutes later, Naruto stifled a laugh as he looked at his handiwork. With more time, he could have created something more elaborate, but sadly he had to make use of his more childish side. Gods, he felt like a teenager from the modern world, laughing at something so mundane and perfectly natural. Teenagers found the silliest of things funny these days, but once again, humor was one of the many things that changed over the years. It was all sex jokes and penis reverences these days. Oh well. At least, this will teach him. Creating one more clone, he watched as the clone moved behind the sleeping god, crouched down and extended his index and middle finger until they were inches away from Hermes' derriere. A subtle nod from the original made the clone whisper, lightning release, two-finger jolt. The result was instant. 1 second, Hermes was peacefully sleeping away with his head in his arms, and the next, he was 5 feet in the air, his eyes wide as his hands fell to his bottom as a sharp pain radiated from his left cheek. The clone quickly disappeared as Hermes landed on his feet. Hey! You're awake! Hermes heard, turning around and facing the counter, where the original Naruto was waiting with a drink in one hand and a paper bag in the other. You were really out of it. I tried to wake you, but you're one of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen. I wondered if you died for a moment. Wadash, I fell asleep. The god rubbed his eyes, blinking the sleep out of them. When his eyes landed on the clock behind the counter, he went as pale as a ghost. Wait a minute. How long have I been asleep? About 20 minutes. Maybe 25. Oh, no. Hermes ran a hand through his hair while the other grabbed his phone out of his pocket. He scrolled through his delivery list and felt his earlier stress return with a vengeance. There were half a dozen more orders, and they were all over the world. This was going to take him all morning and into the afternoon. I'm so screwed. As he headed for the door in a half jog, a cough caught his attention. Naruto stood looking at him with a knowing look, shaking the paper cup and bag at him. Aren't you forgetting something? Oh, right. Running back and taking his order, Hermes placed some mortal money on the table for the drink before bolting and throwing the door open. Thanks again. As sudden as he appeared, the god of messengers disappeared. As soon as the door shut behind him, the blonde ninja's calm facade broke and started to chuckle to himself. I wonder how long it will take for him to notice. He thought. On his own once more, he clapped his hands together. All right. Let's get this place ready. Olympus. Okay. Something funny is going on here, Hermes thought as he walked the cobbled streets of Mount Olympus. Frowning, he watched as another pair of nymphs often found grazing around the foothills of Olympus sauntered off, erupting into a fit of giggles and hushed tones when they saw him. One by one, as the incidents grew, his paranoia started doing the same. Everyone he came across resulted in the same issue arising. It had been like that all day, and Hermes was beginning to think he was amiss on some kind joke floating around his immortal family. Every delivery stop since this morning, no matter who it was, would either start with them laughing at him or forcing themselves to look away as he handed them their delivery. Even George and Martha, whenever he was inside his chariot/truck, would look away from him. He could have sworn he heard them laughing underneath their hisses. Truth be told, he cared little about his companions after his Spanish latte. He could still taste the delicious remnants of his drink on his lips. The Olympian almost crashed his chariot/truck when he brought it up to his mouth for the first. Not to mention, the lemon squares were heavenly that his eyes nearly rolled into the back of his head. Oh, he understood the appeal after his cup was empty and his bag of lemon squares became substantially lighter. It was damn good. No. It was better than good. It was amazing. It was no wonder his sisters and the love goddess were taken with the little cafe the way they were. He would be going back in the future, and this time at a reasonable time. It could be a good place to pick up beautiful women too. Desiring nothing more than the rest he'd deservedly earned, he headed in the direction of his temple, located on the eastern side of Olympus. As he closed in on his home, Hermes spied a cloaked figure coming from the opposite direction. His smile grew, as the scent of toasted marshmallows and wood smoke danced around his nose and grew stronger the closer the figure got. There was only one person on Olympus who carried that delicious scent. And Hestia. Hestia, the eldest of the gods and the firstborn child of Cronus and Rhea, was as every bit as beautiful as her two younger sisters, carrying the sweet demeanor that earned her the love and respect from every resident on Olympus. Truthfully, she was desired by many on Olympus, and history had shown the suitors that offered themselves to her beauty. However, all were turned away, as Hestia remained true to her vow. Woe to any man who dared force themselves upon the goddess of the hearth, and would find themselves sent into the eternal darkness within Tartarus. Hello, her. Her voice broke halfway through his name, her eyes marginally widening. Oh dear. Huh. Hermes, dear. His aunt's face softened, though a hint of annoyance laced her voice. Have you been spending time with Ares again? Or did you run into Io? He shook his head. Not recently. I just got home from deliveries. He hadn't seen Ares all week. The god of war had disappeared off into the mortal world with Aphrodite again, likely on one of their so-called getaways, and the pair likely wouldn't be back for another week or so. Io, on the other hand, hadn't been seen in years. His wayward older sister didn't visit much, primarily due to the estrangement between her and her parents. I see. Hermes watched as a mirror was conjured in his aunt's hand. Have you looked in the mirror recently? Shaking his head, his aunt held the mirror up to his face, and Hermes couldn't stop his jaw from dropping. What the hell? A choked gasp erupted from his body and caught himself leaning closer to the mirror, his hand reaching up and touching his forehead. Aunt Hestia. Yes, Hermes. Why is there a penis drawn on my face? His aunt's smile never faltered. I don't know, Hermes. I was hoping you would fill me in. I'm equally as confused as you are. Hermes got a sense his good-natured aunt was trying her best not to laugh at his current predicament. The way the edges of her mouth twitched and the way her idle hand tugged at the hems of her sleeves were a telltale sign. It wasn't hard for the Olympian to determine who defaced his face. There was only one moment in the day where he could say he was unaware of his surroundings. How had he not noticed? It was over 12 hours later. He'd been walking around with a penis drawn on his face the whole day. It was no wonder people couldn't keep a straight face when they saw him. Even Hestia looked ready to bust a gut in hysterics. That asshole barista did this to me. The image of Naruto appeared in his mind, and Hermes couldn't stop his eyes from blazing with godly energy. No wonder he seemed in such a good mood when he woke up. His aunt's eyebrows raised. Barista. He threw his hands in the air, the one Aphrodite keeps talking about. He stomped away, snapping his fingers and making the ink-drawn penis disappear from his forehead. If he thinks he got one over on me, then he's got another thing coming. Doesn't he know who I am? Rubbing his hands like a Disney villain, a devious glint appeared in his eyes. Oh. The payback that's coming his way will be legendary. I practically invented mischief and pranks. The smile never faltered from Hestia. I'm sure, dear. Though I'm sure he meant no harm, so please go easy on the mortal. Nothing life-threatening, please, she asked, with an edge of authority laced in her words. Granted, the mortal had been rather ballsy to do such a thing to her immortal nephew, but he didn't deserve to die over it. Thankfully, Hermes was one of the more laid-back gods on Olympus. If such a thing happened to Ares, or gods forbid Zeus, then she doubted the mortal would last another second. He'd be reduced to ash before he could blink. I won't do anything rash, Aunt Hestia. I'm just going to one-up him. That's all. I'm not that petty. Thank you, Hermes. Watching him walk away, Hestia spied the clothes on his back, before letting out a giggle as she covered her mouth. It appeared the face sketch had not been the only gift Hermes received. On the back of Hermes' mailman uniform, the barista also added some extra patchwork to his mailman uniform. In this case, in bright orange letters, the words, "Juicy," in all capitals, were sewn across his back, with an arrow pointing down to Hugh Nephew's posterior. "I wonder how long it will be before he notices," Hestia muttered to herself, watching her nephew march away before continuing down the path, the odd giggle escaping her lips throughout the rest of her day. Chapter 4, Part 4. Dining with Divinity. "Okay, I've got 3 coffees for the 3 of you," Naruto spoke cheerfully, lowering his tray close to the table as he placed the 3 cups of steaming coffee next to his waiting customers. "I'm sorry for the wait. It's been a little hectic in here this past hour." "That's okay. We don't mind," the woman in the middle said, her dark brown eyes flickering between Naruto and the 2 other women on either side of her. "It smells heavenly, doesn't it, girls?" "Absolutely. It was worth the wait." His smile widened a fraction, and bowed his head to them. "You're very kind." If he had to guess, the 3 young women sat around the table appeared to be sisters, possessing long dark hair and elfin-like features that only served to enhance their appearance. They attracted some attention from the other patrons, though they didn't appear to notice. Though the winter was reaching its end and its chill lingered in the air, all 3 were wearing dress tops that left their arms bare. Each was comprised of different shades of white, making Naruto shiver looking at them. He guessed some people didn't get affected by the cold as others did. He wished he was that lucky. Moments before the 3 women came inside, the current of the wind strengthened for the briefest of moments. It was enough for the regular citizens of New York not to make heads or tails of it, but it was enough for him to take notice. Years of training on Mount Mayabuka had sharpened his senses to an extreme level, to the point where he could sense nature chakra and related energy sources without the need to activate Sage Mode. The women, while nowhere near the level of particular individuals that visited the Fox's Den, he could sense were still stronger than the average human by a sizable amount. Not to mention when they walked into view of the store, he could have sworn their hair and the hems of their dress tops were dancing in the air. Like the others, he saw no reason to keep them away. As long as they didn't start any funny business, then they were welcome any time. "Now, I've got 2 slices of the Russian honey biscuit cake." He lowered the plates down, and felt a bubble of excitement as the 2 women on the left and right made dreamy expressions as they gazed at their orders. Their forks found their way into their hands like magic, and were eagerly digging in before he could lower the 3rd plate onto the table, and 1 sticky toffee pudding. A similar look arose of the middle woman and saw her mouth silent words to herself. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." "We certainly will," she muttered, slipping a piece into her mouth and letting out a sigh of pleasure. The 2 next to her erupted into a fit of giggles, with the blonde leaving them to enjoy their orders. Truth be told, as he wandered back to the counter, he'd noticed more and more similar individuals and groups like the 3 women appearing as of late. It had been happening over the last couple of weeks, during sporadic times in the day. He'd felt something off about them all as soon as they appeared close to the den, though he sensed differences with the energy and life force that coursed through their veins. Some were like the women currently in a daze with their cake orders, where the natural energy within them felt air-based. Others that came felt more connected to the earth, more traditional energy, much like when he manipulated senjutsu. In the back of his mind, the energy reminded him of the Zetsu clones created from the first Hokage's cells, though with none of the malevolent intent or evil nature. All he felt was positivity radiating from them, and all had a tinge of green to their skin that only he noticed. Though, not that he let on. Then there was the small group a few days ago with energy that radiated like the sea, with a distinct smell of the ocean and the beaches lingering on their person. More often than not, they were all beautiful, all possessing the elfin appearances he became accustomed to when greeting and serving them. 90% of the time, they were women, though occasionally, a male or 2 appeared through his doors. It started with an individual, or a pair visiting each day, but soon the Fox's Den was becoming a hotspot for the elfin beauties. Each day, more and more seemed to be appearing. If he was honest, Naruto never imagined the Fox's Den would become a hotspot for nymphs of all things. It took him a couple of visits to realize what they were. If he had to put money on it, then the three women sat around the table currently must have been air nymphs, if what he felt was any indication. The number of encounters he'd had with nymphs weren't many and were sporadic over the years. Thinking back on it, the last time he saw a nymph was over 300 years ago, somewhere in Europe. Germany if he remembered right, or possibly France. With a moment of peace and everyone inside happy with their orders, the blonde grabbed a spare tray and started moving around the tables, collecting up the finished plates and cups. Thanks to the first 3 months being a success, Naruto chose to make a few changes in the kitchen, namely to make the working hours for his clones a little easier. His clones had been a godsend, and if not for them, his menu for the den would have been a fraction of what he offered, especially when it came to the cakes and desserts. So, he installed a commercial dishwasher and glass washer, instead of cleaning them all by hand by the sinks. So far, it had made a world of difference. It was always funny to see how the smallest of things could make all the difference in the workplace. He was halfway around the room making his rounds, his tray stacked high with plates and cups when he found himself freezing in place. His eyes flickered up to the entrance of the den, hovering over the door. Slowly, he journeyed back to the front after dropping the tray off in the kitchen, handing it off to a clone who looked at him with a serious expression. Every clone behind him had stopped, each wearing a similar look on their faces. They felt it too. It was another energy signature. However, this one was vastly different from the nymphs that occupied his tables. He didn't sense any attachment to the air, or the earth, or the sea. It was darker in nature and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. In short, the energy felt like death. Looking across the room, the trio of nymphs had sensed the oncoming power as well, if the way their bodies stiffened. Their eyes were wide as dinner plates, expressions stuck in a mask of fear and terror. No one else in the room appeared to be affected, though he had no time to determine how or why when the bell over the doorway jingled, a waft of cold air entering the room as a body walked inside. The person in question was male, standing around the same height as himself with skin the color of teakwood. His eyes were a haunting shade of gold, like the honey he offered to his customers with their tea and coffee. Long black hair flowed past his shoulders, like a curtain of shadows that covered part of his regal and king-like face. He was dressed immaculately, wearing a suit that made the Hollywood stars from the TV look inadequate in comparison. Across the room, as he made his way towards the counter, some of his female customers took notice. If the blushes appearing on their faces were any indication, they found the man very attractive. When he got to the counter, Naruto noticed the man looking around the room, not giving anything away with his expressionless face. The man made him feel a little on edge, though outwardly he didn't show it. Anyone that gave off a sense of death needed to be closely watched, especially around so many civilians who were none the wiser. He looked at the three nymphs out of the corner of his eye, though noticed the man briefly look their way as well. All three visibly gulped, and to Naruto's surprise, gave the man a short curtsy, despite being sat down. Just who is this guy? He thought, before putting on a smile. Welcome to the Fox's Den, Naruto welcomed, ending the silence and catching the man's attention. As he did with every customer, he took out a menu and offered it to the finely dressed man. However, unlike everyone else that walked through his doors, the man didn't take the menu. Instead, he stared at Naruto, then looked in the glass cabinet where many of the den's cakes were presented to the public, and then back at the blonde. Are you the owner of this establishment? His voice was rich and velvety. It was so smooth the blonde could picture the voice belonging in a blues club, making the women swoon and sway with his velvety tunes. I am. Is there something I can help you with? The man nodded, lacing his fingers together and placing them on top of the counter. You can. My name is Mr. Black. I'm here representing a client, if you will, who wishes to privately book your establishment out for an afternoon. Naruto's eyebrows raised in surprise. This was a first. Really? Truthfully, he hadn't looked into the idea of customers privately renting the space out for an afternoon, or an evening. Really, the man nodded, his face remaining impassive as honey gold met blue. My client has caught wind of your establishment and heard the glowing reviews from members of her family that have already visited. Her interest has piqued because of it, and she wishes to visit you to see if the word of mouth is true. The blonde nodded, though he adopted a confused look. Well, that's great and all, but why does she need to rent out the entire place? Can't she visit during my regular days? The list when we're open is displayed on the window on the right as you enter. Unfortunately not, due to certain time constraints. The man known as Mr. Black answered back immediately as if expecting the question. My client is a busy woman, who has important duties and responsibilities that she must see to, around these months in particular. The man shifted his stance, reaching into his pocket and pulled a check. Her current place of work can be rather time-consuming. Rubbing the back of his head, Naruto guessed he could understand the reasoning, though renting it out for one person seemed a bit much. Who was this person anyway? Some kind of CEO of some big-time corporation? Or maybe some visiting princess, or queen? He was sure he didn't have any royalty visit his little cafe yet. At least, none that he knew of anyway. Not to mention, if this guy who sensed like death was working for someone, did that mean the woman he was referring to also carried around the same kind of feeling? Humming to himself, and tapping his fingers against the counter, Mr. Black patiently waited for Naruto to speak. So, it's one person renting the place out? Am I getting that right? I'll be catering to one person if I accept. 2. Her husband will be coming with her. The blonde sighed as the picture forming in his mind became clearer. Okay, I guess that makes sense. They want a private space to enjoy their meal. That's correct. Motioning for his visitor to wait one moment, the blonde disappeared into the back room. Before long, he returned, this time with a red book in his hands, revealed to be a business diary. It shouldn't be too much of an issue, so long as they give me some time to warn my other customers. This is the first time I've done something like this since I opened. Taking out a pen from beneath the counter, he held it ready in his hand. Did your client have a date in mind? She did. She would like the 14th of February. The 14th of dash, Naruto started, beginning to flick through the pages before stopping a moment later. He gave the man a deadpan stare. The 14th of February. That's right. So, Valentine's Day? Once again, that is correct. Putting down his pen, Naruto gave the so-called Mr. Black a skeptical look. This guy couldn't be serious, could he? Let me get this straight. Your client wants to privately book out my cafe for an afternoon on Valentine's Day of all days? One of the potentially busiest days of the year for someone like me? Which also happens to be tomorrow. The blonde shinobi felt like wringing the guy's neck when he nodded. That's right. Hence, why I was given this. He held up the hand with the check still resting in his grasp and placed it down on the counter. My client is the understanding kind, and to compensate you for your time and willingness to accept under short notice, I was permitted to offer you a blank check. Naruto blinked in surprise and tilted his head when he stared down at the check. True to Mr. Black's words, the part of the check that displayed the amount of money was blank of any writing, while a very neatly written signature was present in the bottom corner. Your client is serious about this, huh? She is. She is a lady of taste and is not the type who visits the average establishment. For her to come to your business and bring her husband with her is a great honor. The blonde noticed the way the smartly dressed man enforced the last part of his sentence. So, I can write any amount on here. The man nodded, so he further asked, I could write down something like $1 million and that wouldn't be an issue. Watching Mr. Black closely, the man pushed a lock of stray hair out of his face, his gold eyes boring into his own with something akin to amusement. Mr. Uzumaki. Naruto nodded, and let the man continue. All I will say is that money is of no issue to my clients. Name your price, and I shall inform my client you will be expecting them tomorrow without delay. The blonde shinobi couldn't help but whistle, both in amazement and amusement. Whoever they were, they must have pockets that ran deep into the earth if they could throw around words like that. Rubbing his chin as he let the information sink in, he ignored Mr. Black's expressionless stare as the man waited for a response. The blonde shinobi of old wasn't worried when it came to money. Not in the slightest. Over the years of his existence, Naruto had done the smart thing and kept a little nest egg to the side that over time began to grow and grow. It was the side effects of becoming a responsible adult. When his decision to come to New York and set up shop was decided, he dipped into that nest egg and got everything he would need with it. His home. The fox's den. All the appliances, and furniture. Not to mention all his ingredients. If he was honest, when everything was added up, it hadn't broken the tip of the iceberg of the fortune he was sitting on. He rarely touched it and had it all hidden away in a location only he was aware of. Everything he made from the fox's den went into a bank account he set up before arriving. He couldn't look too suspicious. Then again, I am running a business and that's a whole afternoon of revenue not coming my way. $1 million is too much, even if their pockets are too deep to make sense of. He didn't want to appear too greedy, but if they were offering a chance to fill his wallet then why not? He wouldn't go too overboard. $10,000 and you have yourself a deal. Seemed like a fair ask. Hiding his surprise, he watched as Mr. Black didn't bat an eyelash and pulled out a fancy-looking Mont Blanc fountain pen from his inside pocket. Is that made of real gold? How fancy are these people? Scribbling the amount on the check, Mr. Black looked him dead in the eye, the check being offered to the blonde barista. Taking it and giving it a once-over, Naruto smirked at Mr. Black. I hope this doesn't bounce. That would be embarrassing after everything the man just told him. Mr. Black didn't react. He remained completely stone-faced as he replied, trust me, Mr. Uzumaki, it won't. If you say so. Glancing at the name written on the check, he rose an eyebrow. Mrs. P. Underhill? Might I inquire what her first name is? I like to know the names of the people whose money I'm taking. Rolling his neck, a distinct pop made the mysterious Mr. Black sigh in comfort before answering, you'll get your answers tomorrow. Until then, all you need to know is that my clients will arrive tomorrow at 4 p.m. How long they will stay for, I don't know. However, I recommend that you prepare thoroughly. Mrs. Underhill is known to be demanding if the gossip she's heard about your food is anything to go by. He leaned in, with Naruto reacting by doing the same. She has a sweet tooth that puts many to shame, though can be picky. She has high expectations. Is that right? Naruto rubbed his chin, a thoughtful expression sweeping over him. If she had high expectations, then he would need to pull a few rabbits out of his hat. As confident as he was that his menu would knock their socks off, he could prepare some specials dishes for his guests. If they were willing to part with $10,000, then he was going to give them their money's worth. A couple of ideas were floating around. He could have a lot of fun with this. He had a few dishes in the pipeline he could test out tomorrow. Are there any dietary restrictions I should know about? None. Any preferences I should know about? Again, Mr. Black shook his head. Well, that made things easy. All right then. In that case, you have yourself a deal. The blonde extended his hand to the man. Tell Mr. and Mrs. Underhill I'll have some specials whipped up just for them. I'll make sure they get their money's worth. It took a few moments of silence before Mr. Black reciprocated. The man had a firm handshake, and Naruto couldn't help noticing how cold the man's hands were. They felt like ice cubes. I'll pass on the message. Nodding, the blonde pocketed the check. Before the man left, he spoke up again, can I get you anything before you go? Mr. Black was prepared to turn around and leave at a moment's notice, but he couldn't deny the smell radiating from the fox's den was heavenly. He looked across the room, ignoring the shivering forms of the nymphs, and looks at what some of the mortals were eating and drinking. He hadn't visited a cafe in the mortal world in decades. His eyes flickered to the cabinet with the cakes, zeroing in on the chocolate cake to the far left. His tongue licked the edge of his mouth. That looks good. Straightening his tie, his voice was low, almost a whisper, I'll take a slice of the chocolate cake to go, and a regular coffee with no sugar. Coming right up. Valentine's Day. My dear, you can't be serious, Hades muttered, his voice low as his dark eyes took in the orange frame that wrapped around the front of the building. He'd never seen something so hideous and deliberate in centuries. It was like a monstrous beacon of color, and far too bright for his rich taste. Being in an environment where the brightest colors were the glowing crimsons and dark yellows that emanated from the rivers of lava that ran through the underworld, he could say that if he ever found something that sickly shade of orange anywhere near his home, he would send it deep into Tartarus. It would never see the light of day again if he had his way. Who in their right mind would paint the front of their business orange? Standing on his left, his wife of nearly 5,000 years stood in all her outstanding beauty and glory, an array of shopping bags of all shapes and sizes in her grasp. Persephone was as beautiful as the day he first laid eyes on her, more so than that pesky love goddess in his opinion. The shining flower of the underworld, her very presence brought out a side of the eldest son of Cronus that few would get to see. When it was time to separate and her time came to return to Olympus, it was like the joy and happiness she brought with her would evaporate, leaving nothing but his dark thoughts and the ever-present wails of those within the fields of punishment. He felt his wife lean into him, the top of her head barely coming up to his shoulder. Even wearing those ludicrous heeled boots she chose to wear on their outings into the mortal world, he towered over her as he did with most people. He didn't show it, but he was disappointed she wasn't wearing the black dress she frequently wore whilst in the underworld. The one that billowed around her body like smoke, and gave off an aura of mystery. Millennia on from the day they married and his wife was still capable of making his godly itcher boil with desire. Don't be a bore, Hades. There's nothing wrong with adding a splash of color to an otherwise dull palette. A snort came out of Hades. Persephone, a splash of color is painting a window frame red, or a letterbox a shade of blue. A splash of color is not painting the outside of the building the most hideous shade of orange imaginable. Be that as it may, I like it. You would like it. Are you doubting my tastes? Never, my dear. I'm merely showing how different our color preferences are. Dressed in one of his finest suits for their day in the mortal world, the god of the underworld hadn't been able to hide his skepticism when his wife informed him of their plans for Valentine's Day. If the elder god was honest, he didn't see the point in Valentine's Day. It was a silly little mortal holiday that used that dreadful son of Aphrodite and Ares as the mascot. The love goddess was bad enough on the rare occasion that he came into contact with her, but her son was equally as bad. The only difference between them was Aphrodite knew where the line was when it came to her Olympian family. Eros, on the other hand, had a habit of forgetting the line existed. Being one of the few gods who could strike genuine fear into the hearts of an Olympian like Zeus, Demeter, and Hera thanks to the powers endowed to him by Aphrodite, Hades always kept one eye open should he discover Eros was nearby and in the neighborhood. Those love-enforced arrows of his could do more harm than good. By some divine miracle, the son of Aphrodite knew better than to pick a fight with him, though he couldn't deny a piece of him wished the little pigeon-winged cherub would give it a try. Oh, the satisfaction he would get from beating that little annoyance into Tartarus would be legendary. Back to the point of Valentine's Day, Hades didn't understand why he needed to show his wife how much he loved her on this one particular day. During the 6 months of the year that Persephone was in his embrace, he tried to show her every day how much he loved her. Granted, there were missteps along the way and their time together had been a learning experience for both of them. His undeserving black heart did love his queen and wife to Tartarus and back. He didn't need a silly holiday to show it in excess. Well, shall we go in? Persephone asked, her watery gold eyes silently motioning to the front door and unaware of his thoughts. Sighing, the god of the underworld knew there was no getting around it. Very well. Persephone puffed out her cheeks in annoyance. You could try and sound enthusiastic. That was me being enthusiastic. His response only served to get a groan out of his wife. Crossing his arms over his chest, his dark pupils flickered to the corner of his eyes, looking in the direction of the Empire State Building. A heavy scowl marred his face, and one of his hands tightened into a fist. Although the mist-shrouded Olympus from the sight of the mortals, Hades could feel its presence lingering over the famous skyscraper. The home of the Greek pantheon has never been a home to him, nor did it welcome him like it did the rest of his family. Being near its doorstep, it never failed to stir up old and bitter feelings. His so-called family were the ones who made him into the person he was, keeping him at a distance at all times and never trusting him the same way after the Titanomachy. His temple should have been on Olympus, just as his brothers and sisters were built on its surface. Hell, Poseidon had one on Olympus and within Atlantis. There was no telling how many that dunderhead, Zeus had. The point was, he helped build Olympus into what it was, and should have been recognized for that like the rest of them. Why couldn't they have gone to another city? Before Hades could let his thoughts begin running away, the petite and smooth hand of his wife laced through his fingers. The contact was enough to halt those thoughts. Stop thinking about them. I wasn't. He didn't fight her grip as she pried his hand away from his crossed arms. Yes, you were. A pang of sympathy ran through Persephone's chest. The goddess of spring had learned the telltale signs of her husband over the millennia. She knew something was bothering him like a pit in her stomach. I know you don't like being so close to Olympus and it stirs up old feelings and grudges, but we've had a nice day out so far, haven't we? It took a moment, but Hades gave a short nod. Good, I'm glad. Let's not spoil it with ill feelings. His expression softened. It's not that I haven't enjoyed our time today. I have enjoyed it, I promise. He gave her hand a light squeeze, and felt the corners of his mouth twitch up when she smiled at the gesture. I don't see why we couldn't have gone somewhere else. California? Boston? Even Miami would have been a welcome change. The essence of my siblings and Zeus's ilk can be sensed all across New York. I'm surprised we haven't run into one of them yet. A sigh escaping her lips, Persephone dropped her bags and laced her arms around her husband's neck. The gesture was enough to feel Hades lean his body into her, embracing in the warmth she provided. Despite the size difference in their appearance, the queen of the underworld proved she was stronger than she looked. Today is all about us. Don't make it about them. Hades stayed silent for a couple of moments, letting her words sink in. I know, and I'll try. That's all I ask. Standing on her tiptoes, Persephone laid a gentle kiss on her husband's pale cheek. Put them out of your mind and enjoy this place with me. I've heard great things about it. Even the Natos told me how much he enjoyed the food here. The crumbs from his chocolate cake were still on the corner of his lips when he came to confirm the reservation. I guess if the Natos enjoyed it, then it's worth a try, Hades admitted. Like most of the gods and goddess of his ever-expanding godly family, his lieutenant was a picky eater, and like himself, had a rich taste when it came to mortal cuisine. If the Natos enjoyed what he ate, then it couldn't have been awful. Though, he was still skeptical about the kind of man that painted part of a building orange. Lead the way, my love. Persephone beamed at Hades, the twitching of his lips strengthening until a small smile graced his often scowling face. Pushing the door open, the sound of the bell rang as they entered. Like their fellow immortals, a wave of warmth shrouded over them, and Hades watched as his wife visibly relaxed and together they took in the room. The rich smell of coffee laced the air, reminding him of the mornings his wife would wake him up with his favorite blend of coffee. The room was bigger than either of them expected, with tables and chairs pushed to each side, with one singular table with two chairs sat in the middle of the room. You must be the Underhills. Both sets of eyes gazed over to the counter, where the patiently waiting owner was stood. The Underhills. Hades thought, rolling his eyes at the surname Persephone had given them. His wife loved coming up with new aliases for them during matters like this. Walking out from behind the counter, Naruto extended his hand to Hades, a pleasant smile on his face as he greeted the pair of immortals. My name's Naruto Uzumaki, the owner of the Fox's Den. First things first, I would like to thank you for taking an interest in my humble establishment. When your representative came by yesterday, I hardly believed it. I thought he was joking at first, but I can see he was telling the truth. It's nice to meet you both. Shaking his hand, Hades noted the firm grip the blonde gave him and felt his wife step forward and offer her hand. Instead of shaking her hand though, Naruto gently took her hand into his own and placed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The act was enough for Persephone to widen her smile. She liked a mortal with manners. He's very easy on the eyes too, Persephone thought. A handsome face, and a very nice body if the way his clothes tighten on his body is any indication. She was no Aphrodite, but she could window shop from time to time. You're most welcome, and I'm happy you accepted my offer. I'm sorry for the short notice, but the news doesn't tend to travel to our neck of the woods until much later, though I've heard nothing but good things about this place. If he had told the Natos no, then Persephone planned on having him wrapped up in the mist and make it happen either way. I'm Penelope Underhill, and this is my husband, Hank Underhill. Persephone promptly ignored the look her husband was giving her. Well, come over and take a seat. Reaching behind the counter, he pulled out 2 menus and offered them to the pair of gods. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to look at the menu. He motioned to their table. Also, just so you're aware, I've got some specials of the day prepared for you both. Think of it as my way of ensuring you get your money's worth today. I'll read them out when I take your orders. Thank you, that sounds delightful, Persephone replied, the excitement brimming as she wondered what Naruto had prepared for them. Gently, she pulled her husband to their table, with the god of the underworld glancing at Naruto from the corner of his eyes. Making themselves comfortable and discarding her coat, Persephone eyed her husband. So? What do you think so far? The god of the underworld took notice of the excitement in his wife's voice. She looked at him expectantly, without trying anything on the menu. I can't make any judgment yet. When his wife scowled at him, he internally sighed and made a change to his answer. It appears adequate. The place has a nice atmosphere. The rich smell of coffee is pleasing, I'll admit. As suspected, her face made a 180. I knew you'd like it. The goddess of spring sounded very pleased with herself. There's so much to choose from in here. I'm not sure where to start. The beginning would suffice. A kick to his shin beneath the table forced him to grunt. Don't be sarcastic, my love. It's unbecoming of you. Persephone remained focused on the menu, a content smile plastered on her face. Hades could see her eyes at work, taking in all her options. I wonder what specials he made for us. It's all very intriguing. I find myself curious also, Hades replied. An annoyed expression wormed its way onto his face. Was Hank the best you could think of? It's a nice name. It's a traditional name in the mortal world. The goddess glanced up. Is there something wrong with my choice? Nothing, but I don't see why we can't use our real names. Because no self-respecting mortal woman would name their child after the god of the underworld. Name one mortal carrying your name, and we can go home right now. When he didn't speak, Persephone's smile gained a satisfaction to it. I rest my case. Now, less brooding and more choosing. Understood. Remaining silent, Hades opened the menu up and let his dark eyes scan over the contents. He would let Persephone have her fun. His wife did appear excited during their shopping spree earlier in the afternoon. There appears to be something for everything in here, he mumbled, his hand coming up to sweep his oily black hair back. He must go through ingredients like they're going out of fashion if he offers everything he says he does. He must be doing well to afford it. As the richest member of his Olympian family, call him curious if he wondered how a mortal could afford such a massive selection. Most places he was aware of didn't provide a third of what the blonde owner was offering to his clientele. Did he make everything that was listed on the menu? If not, then he must have dozens of suppliers in the pipeline. His cash flow must be a constant wave. He couldn't help with the way he thought. As the god of riches, it sparked his curiosity. Focus, Hades. Pick something before your wife calls you out on it. While Hades was busy mulling over his thoughts, Persephone was busy biting the corners of her mouth. She couldn't decide what she wanted. Everything sounded so good. Where to start? If it wasn't for word getting to her by Hermes, who was delivering a package to Hecate in her residence within the underworld, then she wouldn't have heard a peep about the fox's den. News tended to reach the underworld slower than most, though when she asked why she hadn't heard about such a place existing sooner, she noticed Hermes begin to shuffle around uncomfortably. Surely, any place that attracted the attention of multiple Olympians was worth hearing about. Despite not being an Olympian, being one of the eldest children of Zeus, as well as the queen of the underworld had its perks. Suffice to say, it took 5 minutes before she had Hermes spilling out all the gossip on Olympus. Her time in the underworld had provided her with many a means to get the information out of her unwilling hostage. By the time she let her little brother free, Persephone was internally seething. Cracks formed on the marble floor of her husband's palace as she marched back to her chambers. That damn Aphrodite. Oh, she knew the love goddess could be petty, but she was asking for it now. Aphrodite had done everything in her power to keep the information from getting to the queen of the underworld, and Persephone knew why. Their little rivalry that started with Adonis all those years ago continued to plague them to this day and only worsened as time went on. The two goddesses used to be good friends, but these days after the Adonis incident, their relationship never recovered. The two were always trying to one-up each other in a variety of ways, to the point that the other gods would simply bypass them. The stunts they pulled on each other were legendary. However, when one of her mother's servants informed her by iris message that the love goddess planned to visit and spend the evening at the fox's den with the owner's scrumptious treats, the goddess of spring couldn't help but throw a wrench in her plans. Valentine's Day was a big day for Aphrodite, and Persephone couldn't help but grin at the satisfaction of denying the love goddess of what she desired. Even if it was for only one day. She couldn't sense the love goddess's essence anywhere near the fox's den, which meant she hadn't stopped by yet. The look on her face would be priceless. When 5 minutes passed, the two gods felt their host appear next to them, his notebook and pen in hand as he gave them a polite smile. "So, before I take your orders, would you like me to read out the specials for you?" The blonde looked pleased with himself. "Yes, please," Persephone replied, followed by a nod from Hades. She couldn't wait. "Well," Naruto started, "for this special day, I have arranged 3 different dishes for you, all of which were freshly baked earlier today. The first of which is a grapefruit curd tart with chamomile whipped cream." Persephone's eyes lit up, followed by an audible intake of air. "The second is a fig almond tea cake with a coconut honey glaze. Finally, since it's Valentine's Day, I thought the third option should be something related to the subject of love, so I prepared a chocolate-dipped strawberry Neapolitan cake." Hades hummed as he leaned back in his chair. The god of the underworld wouldn't admit it out loud, but the choices laid out to them sounded very appetizing. If the mortal prepared such dishes for them, and if he liked them, he would be willing to leave a generous tip for the man, despite the money already provided. Despite his reputation, Hades commended hard work and dedication. Looking at his wife, Persephone was practically bouncing in her chair, her eyes lit up like fireworks. If the dishes were half as good as the gossip suggested, then Persephone contemplated dragging the man to the underworld and having him set up shop just for her. She had a spot in mind next to her famous garden. That way, she and her husband could have their orders brought to them on the veranda overlooking the fields of asphodel. Her fellow goddesses might not be happy with the change in location, and it meant they would have to gain her husband's permission to enter his realm if they wanted to visit. Seeing his wife's excitement, he snapped his menu shut and looked his wife square in the eye. "In that case, we'll take all 3. My wife and I will share a plate of each of your specials between us." Naruto nodded and wrote it down on his notepad. His smile widened when he saw Persephone reach over the table and take her husband's free hand into her own. A tiny smile grew on the face of Hades and winked in his wife's direction. It was beautiful to see how in love the pair were with each other. He got the feeling the husband was the type who would go to the moon and back if it made his wife happy. "You guys are a sweet couple." "That's kind of you to say," Persephone replied, her thumb tracing against her husband's pale skin. "He can be as stubborn as a mule when he wants to be, and moodier than a bull seeing red, but deep down my hubby is a softie. Not enough people are lucky enough to see that side of him, but I do." She gave her husband a reassuring squeeze. "It hasn't been easy, but we've been married for a long time and overcome obstacles that would cause most to call it quits. I hope he knows how much I have come to love him." The god of the underworld's expression softened further. "He does." "You're lucky to have each other," Naruto replied, his gaze turning and staring out the window at the people walking the pavement across the road. "Most people these days don't seem to understand how precious marriage is, especially when the right person comes along. It provides an opportunity to grow in selflessness as you serve your wife, or husband, and any children that come from the union. It's more than a physical union, it is also a spiritual and emotional union." Both immortals looked at him with mild surprise. They both looked into his blue eyes and noticed a sadness within them. "Any kids?" Both nodded. "A daughter," Hades quietly replied, still looking up at the blonde owner with an inquisitive stare. "That's nice. Are you married?" The question came from Persephone. Right before her eyes, she noticed a momentary shift happen with the blonde owner. Like a door had been cracked open, followed by a wave of sadness briefly resonating from his person, and his face gaining a faraway look as a sad smile took over. Persephone almost wished she hadn't asked. "Widowed?" "Oh," her voice was quiet, "I'm sorry." She hadn't intended to stir up old feelings. To be so young and already a widow must have been difficult. He looked barely out of his 20s. It took a few silent moments before the blonde shook off the sadness, his smile returning to normal and waving a hand in the air. "Don't be. It was a long time ago." Seeing you both together reminds me of my time with my wife, and how I wish we had longer together. I miss her, dearly. He brought his notepad and pen back up. Now, let's keep going with your orders, shall we? What would you both like to drink? Oh, that's right. They still had their drinks to order. Releasing her husband's hands, Persephone had a skim through the menu one last time before she confidently knew what she wanted. I would love one of your coconut and vanilla cappuccinos, please. It sounds delicious. Nodding his head, Naruto turned to Hades. Could you serve anything a little stronger? Hades asked. The hot drinks offered on the menu sounded good, but the elder god had a desire for something with an extra something in them. Stronger? In what way? Say with a little extra kick. Hades put some emphasis on the last part and Persephone watched as an understanding occurred between the two men. Tapping his chin with his pen, Naruto made a humming sound. I get you. Normally, I wouldn't serve any alcohol in my drinks, which is why I haven't put any on the menu. Although, I could make an exception given the private setting. Did you have something in mind? Perhaps an Irish coffee? Would that be out of the question? A half grin stretched onto Naruto's face. I think you might be in luck. Naruto gave an appraising look. I like your style, Hank Underhill. Hades nodded in the blonde's direction, saying nothing about the alias. It will take a bit longer to prepare, so I hope you don't mind the wait. That's fine. The rulers of the underworld watched the blonde disappear and get their orders ready, leaving the pair to rejoin their hands across the table. He seems nice. He's all right, Hades replied, for a mortal anyway. Persephone leaned her free elbow on the table, and placed her head in her palm. We should bring Melino with us next time. That girl doesn't leave the underworld enough. Although, she rubbed tiny circles in the back of her husband's hand, it might have to wait until the fall. I'll be returning to Olympus in a few weeks. Maybe we can plan an outing for the three of us when I return in the fall. A grunt came out of Hades' mouth. He wasn't against the idea. He just didn't like hearing his wife speak about their upcoming separation for 6 months. Don't be like that. It will give us something to look forward to when I return in the autumn season. I'd like it better if you stayed with me all year round. Hades spat bitterly. If it wasn't for that overbearing idiot I'm forced to call my sister throwing a tantrum, then you would be with me always. To this day, after millennia had passed, the relationship with Demeter only worsened over time. The goddess of the harvest and the seasons couldn't accept that Persephone could love someone like him. If Demeter had her way, which at one point she did, then she would lock her daughter away in a secret location only known to her, and barred anyone else from their family from ever seeing her. Demeter took the term mother knows best to an extreme level, and he knew how frustrated Persephone could get with the woman who tried to control every aspect of her life. You're doing it again, my love. A knowing look crossed over her face before the goddess stood up from her seat. Never breaking the hold on her husband's hand, Persephone guided her chair around the table and sat next to him. You can't help yourself with forcing negative feelings to filter into your mind, can you? What am I going to do with you? You could stay with me, and tell Demeter to fuck off back to the nearest wheat field. He replied, though regretted it when Persephone picked up a spoon and bobbed him on the forehead with it. Ow. You might not like her, but she is still my mother, no matter how overbearing she can be. It comes from a place of love. Leaning back in her chair, she crossed one leg over the other. If you're a good husband for the rest of today, and you don't allow any more negative thoughts to filter their way in, I might consider treating you later. Treating me. Reaching next to the table, Persephone pulled up one of her many shopping bags and gave it a shake in the air. While you were busy ogling one of the store's clerk's chest, she gave him a brief look, making Hades have the decency to gulp. He thought he'd been more discreet. I went and got a little something from the lingerie department. I thought I could wear it tonight. The lingerie department. Humming in confirmation, a coy smirk wove its way onto her face. Would you like me to wear them for you tonight? It comes with this little piece that leaves little to the imagination. Hands still together, Persephone could almost feel her husband's godly itcher begin to heat up at the thought. Would you like that, my love? Very much so. He'd be a fool not to follow her orders. Good. Then no more negative thoughts and you might get to see it later. Very well, my queen. Small talk broke out between the pair, time passing quicker than either realized. Before long, Naruto returned to their table, smiling at the fact Persephone was sat beside her husband, and started by lowering their drinks onto the table. Both looked impressed with their drinks, noticing no spillage on the side of the cups nor on the tiny plates they were settled on. The goddess of spring could smell the coconut radiating from her drink, and let out a hum of delight the second her drink touched her lips. It was delicious. The coconut and the vanilla could be tasted evenly, and neither overpowered the other. It was perfectly balanced. Oh, that's amazing. She sunk into her husband's side without noticing Hades was still staring down at his drink. It looked good, and the smell of his Irish coffee was heavenly on his sense of smell. Though, he would admit the heart that the blonde owner had decorated on the foam of his drink put him off. Don't think about it. Just enjoy it, and you'll be rewarded when you get home. He was getting his treat. Bringing his drink up to his mouth, Hades found himself pleasantly surprised. It was good. No, it was better than good. It was incredible. It was so good, that Hades checked whether any nectar had been added into the mix. It smelled like freshly baked cookies and tasted like dried fruits, orange peels and baking spices. It was light in body but packed a powerful punch. What whiskey did you use? Sexton Single Malt Irish Whiskey, Naruto replied. I keep a bottle in the office. Sometimes after I close up for the evening, I'll take a glass with me while I clean up. I'm not much of a drinker, but I like a whiskey from time to time. Hades nodded, and offered his wife a sip of his drink, and appeared pleased when her mouth made a tiny O shape after taking a swig. It's good, huh? It's very good. The pair didn't wait long, and moments later, both were rendered awestruck as the plates of food were presented to them. Though for Hades, awestruck was his eyebrows lifting, and his jaw hanging open a minuscule amount. Still, to get the reaction from the god of the underworld was a praiseworthy feat. The moody god rarely showed emotion in front of mortals. Persephone though was much more vocal, and let it be known. Oh! My! Goodness! She clapped her hands together, her taste buds salivating the longer she stared at the dishes. All three of their orders appeared baked to perfection and were beautifully decorated. This is beyond what I imagined. Thank you for saying so, Naruto replied. I hope you enjoy your orders. If there will be anything else, let me know. I'll be stationed by the counter. The blonde gave a short bow out of courtesy and left the mesmerized couple alone to enjoy their meals. Pulling out a book from the counter, he crossed a leg over his knee and sat comfortably as the two immortals enjoyed their orders. Thank you very much, Persephone whispered, her eyes never leaving the three plates. She didn't know where to start. All three looked so appealing she was having a crisis just deciding where to begin. They look so good, but I don't know if I want to spoil the way they look. They're beautiful to look at. Hades looked at his wife and recognized the excitement rushing through her. Her face was mesmerized, and he couldn't blame her. Their food looked like something Hestia, or his mother would create. This mortal was full of surprises. Licking the edge of his lips, Hades picked up the nearest fork and took a piece from the grapefruit tart. He planned on going from left to right. He heard Persephone gasp as if his action was unwarranted before she mimicking his actions. On the count of 3, both brought their pieces up to their mouths, chewed for a couple of seconds, and promptly fell back into their chairs. Both their eyes glazed over in delight, their shoulders slumping in comfort, and their breathing synchronizing. Neither could have prepared for the onslaught of flavor that assaulted their taste buds. Holy gods above! This is the best thing I've ever tasted in my life. Persephone muttered, nothing even comes close. I'm sorry my love, but I think Hestia and your mother no longer hold the top spot anymore. She wasn't kidding. Gods and immortals were notoriously hard to please, in almost every way one could imagine. For a mortal to be talented enough to render herself in such a state with food was unfathomable. My love? Are you okay? The goddess of spring waited a few moments before she got a response, only it wasn't the response she imagined. Instead of words coming out of her husband's mouth, it was a long and drawn-out moan of pure delight erupting from her husband's mouth. It was guttural, like the sound was coming from his very soul. Oh my! By the counter, Naruto didn't even look up from his book. He merely shook his head and continued to read. Persephone said nothing, nor did Hades react to the sight of his wife staring at him with surprise. Instead, he shocked Persephone by cutting a larger piece of the tart with his fork and chomping on the dessert as if it was about to disappear from his life forever. Though he remained silent after the second bite, the smile on his face grew wider and wider by the second. It was as if the tart was pumping pure happiness into the veins of the god of the underworld. Hey! No fair! Stick to your half! Persephone pushed her shock aside and wrestled her husband's fork away from the tart. She wanted another piece too. Don't make me poke you with the end of my fork, my love. It went on that way for the rest of their time spent at the fox's den. Never had the smile on Hades' face reached as wide as it did that afternoon as he ate cake and joked with his wife. Food was truly the way to a person's heart, and Persephone for one loved every second of it. Their afternoon that Valentine's Day became one of their happiest memories in recent memory, and served to cherish the love and bond husband and wife felt for each other. The blonde couldn't fathom the priceless service he'd provided for his two customers. Once the pair of immortals finished devouring the tart, they moved on to the tea cake. Once that was finished, they moved on to the Neapolitan cake. If the moans of delight that came from both Persephone and Hades were any indication, then the day had been a success in Naruto's eyes and ears. For the next couple of hours, the pair continued to order the same special dishes over and over again, and the blonde hadn't minded at all. Watching them out of the corner of his eye, the old shinobi felt old memories begin to stir in the back of his mind as a familiar beauty appeared in his mind. Hinata. Boy, he hadn't thought about his wife in a very long time. Not because he didn't want to see her beautiful face in his mind, but because when he did picture her, it only served to remind him of everything, and everyone he'd lost. The ones that were forever out of his reach. Gone to a place he could never go. Sometimes when he was drifting off to sleep, he imagined her arms wrapping around his body, her head resting on his chest and her legs resting against his knees. Sleeping with Hinata beside him never failed to help lull him to sleep. Whether it was her steady breathing or the sound of her heart beating against his ear. She never failed to see the good in him. Even after becoming Hokage, and the stress and pressure of preserving the peace they all fought so hard to achieve began to pile higher and higher on his shoulders, she never failed to turn that weight as light as feather the moment he stepped inside their family home. Seeing her smiling face, her eyes full of love and arms awaiting his embrace, it was a feeling that he cherished to this day. Other times, he pictured Boruto and Himawari scooching into bed with them. Their son would tuck himself between his parents, his head resting on Hinata's ample chest, while Himawari would lounge against her father. Sometimes her legs would be strewn across his face, or her body horizontal over his stomach. His daughter could sleep in the strangest of positions. These days, he awoke to a cold and empty bed, serving to remind him of his place in the world. They had been gone a long time. Sometimes, for the briefest of moments, he could feel them standing next to him. However, as soon as he became aware of the feeling, it vanished as quickly as it came. He took it as their way of saying hello. Truth be told, he felt a little depressed when they entered his mind. Shaking his thoughts and feelings away while he was on the job, he noticed Mr. Underhill trying to catch his attention, and quickly moved over to fulfill his request. This was his life now, and deep down, he knew he couldn't dwell on the past. No good came from being stuck in the past. It was just hard letting it all go. What can I get for you? While Hades spoke to the blonde and ordered another set of the specials, the goddess of spring remained silent, an eerie feeling in the back of her mind. The hairs on the back of her neck were standing on end and goosebumps ran up and down her arms. She hid her surprise while her husband and the mortal conversed, and turned her head so she was facing the window. Why did she have this feeling someone was watching her? When her golden eyes noticed a figure standing in front of the window, the reason for the feeling became apparent. That's why. Standing behind the glass and going unnoticed by the mortals dotting the street was none other than the goddess of love, stood with her arms firmly set by her sides, her eyes a torrent of angry colors as she tried to glare a hole through the back of Persephone. She sported a new look, like she often would when the two goddesses met in the spring and summertime, with blonde hair in a bob-style haircut. Looking the woman up and down, she saw Aphrodite was wearing a very expensive-looking purple dress. It left an ample amount of cleavage and would have left men and women a salivating mess. It wasn't hard for Persephone to understand what the goddess had planned, and realized the goddess' plan was to entice the delightful blonde owner into joining her in the bedroom. Ha! Not today. A smirk wove its way onto Persephone's face and took a sip of her wonderful drink, mouthing silently how amazing it was to the glaring goddess. The act was enough to make the goddess of love tremble, the glaring intensifying. Aphrodite would likely try and get her back for this in some creative form, but right now, she didn't have the heart to care. Instead, Persephone decided to do the childish thing, and give Aphrodite one last parting gift before returning to her husband's company. She brought up her hand and offered Aphrodite the bird, all the while her smirk widened. "My dear? What are you doing?" Her husband's voice brought her attention back to the table and found Hades and Naruto staring at her. The latter had his notepad and pen in his hand. "Nothing, darling. Nothing at all," she replied, adopting an innocent smile as she clasped her hands together. "Another round of everything then." That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.